All right, so I'll just say a couple more things. So yeah, every object in that's created in Maya is it automatically has a UV map. So the important thing for us to do is organize it in a way that is easy for us to um, assign materials, textures, colors, um, so that we can get the effect that we want. We can get the look that we want. So you can see if I select his, I'm gonna go to the front view, and you can see these white sections, like dividing sections. Those are what I created. Those were not automatically assigned to my character. In fact, um, let's see, reference mesh. Yeah. Oh, this is yeah, this is a, okay, that one's not going to work for us. So I'll just show it on this one. In fact, I think for the most part, if I go to yeah, I'm in modeling, and then I go to polygon modeling. These, when you go to the polygon modeling tab, these icons are what we're going to be using. And you can also find them under, again, in modeling mode, under UVs, best plane, camera-based, contour, stretch, cylindrical. That's what these are. That's what we're going to be playing with today. So for the most part, you might get something that looks like this, which, if I just, if you just select your character, Maya doesn't do it. It's not intending to do a great job figuring this out for you. So you kind of have to do some work. So what I did, I selected the bottom first. So I'm going to go to the front view. So, and you have to be in object mode for this too, or I'm sorry, face mode. So I've switched to object mode. Did I have you guys already create a shader for your character? Let me show you that just in case, and it'll be a good review. So first thing, even before we divide our UV map into sections so we can color it and do whatever, we want to assign a shader to it. And this is going to change because that's one of the parts that I'm going to show you guys. I'm just showing you standard Maya shading right now, but we're also going to animate. We're gonna texture in Arnold. But for now, I'm just going to say assign new material. And I'm just going to pick Lambert. But the important thing is I'm going to go to the end, and usually it's going to be like a Lambert number 4 or 5 or 6. Lambert 1 is what it automatically defaults to when you create a new object. Like if I created a sphere, you can see that its shader is automatically Lambert 1. And that's okay to start with, but you don't want to leave it on Lambert 1 because the tendency is for students to accidentally UV unwrap or assign a map, a texture map to Lambert 1. So anything that they create, if I create another sphere or another box or something, Lambert 1 is used for all of those. So if I assign material to Lambert 1, every single object is going to have that texture to it, which is not what you want to do. So as soon as you create an object, just get in the habit of creating, just assigning a new material. So you right click and hold, go down to assign new material, and then Lambert for something that's matte finished. Blinn is a little bit more shiny. Fongs are a little bit even more shiny. And there's more to it than that, but for now, that's what we're going to use. So I'm going to give this a name, and this is my my pawn. So I'm going to call him pawn. Actually, so if you guys have multiple pawns, different colors, maybe I'll call this guy protester pawn, or maybe I'll just leave out the I'll abbreviate for short, PROT pawn underscore shader, all caps. But I already created one, so I'm going to undo that. All right, so you can see that this guy, if I go to object mode, his shader is called, well, it's Lambert 3, but I should have named it better. So here's Lambert 3, so I'm going to call this protester pawn underscore shader. And that's it, you know, it's still going to be gray for you because you haven't assigned it a texture map. But that's the first thing, is you want to assign it a texture. I'm sorry, assign it a shader, Lambert or Blinn or something to do with Arnold. And then the next thing I did, I'm going to break this into segments. And the pawn is a fairly simple thing to texture map because it's already based on either the sphere or the cylinder shape. So I'm actually going to go to face mode and select the bottom faces. Let's see. Oops, I'm not in face mode. That's the problem. Okay, so I'm going to make a marquee around everything just below this line here. Oh, there it is. Okay. So if I go to the perspective view, you can see that I've just selected. Actually, I selected one more edge than I wanted to. So I'm going to go back to front view. And I'm going to deselect the very top row of edges or faces. Now, if I look again, okay, that's what I wanted. So you can make these you can determine where these segments are going to be, but for the most part, I'm using this line as a segment, and then right where that white line is another segment. Maybe if I would have done this again, I probably would have made this a little bit higher, but that's where I made it for now. And then I put a segment inside the neck, and then one separating the neck from the head. Oh, and then at the very top, I added a top segment, and maybe I may undo this one. We'll see. But the important thing is that you just kind of figure out your object to determine which where you want to segment pieces off so that you can get different textures. Because I don't want this fist to end up on his face, and I don't want it to end up down here. So I have to organize it in a way that that helps me understand where things are. And it doesn't necessarily have to be, you can see all this stuff on the top. Did I lose you guys?
Yeah.
I did. How much, how long ago? Because I didn't even realize that Zoom cut out.
The last thing was like you were talking about how you assigned like a thing to the top of the palm, like the circular thing for the UV shader.
It was like 20 seconds at the most.
Yeah.
Okay, so it wasn't too much. It wasn't like minutes, 30 seconds. Okay. All right, I'm gonna get something. I'll be right back. This again. All right, so selecting what I have on the top, you can see that all these faces are the top. If I select this stuff in the middle here.
You got a screen share.
Oh, sorry, thank you. Let's see. Thought I did. All right, so I'm screen sharing and I'm recording. Okay. There we go. Okay, so I select the stuff in the middle, and you can see that I've organized that to be the neck. And then this would be his torso area here. And then the bottom is his waist or his lower body. And then I have these two circles that represent, you know, the felt of the bottom of the pawn. And then this last one, which is the same size, but that represents the very top. So I select faces. So I have another thing I need to show you. So I'm in the perspective view in my left view, and then the right side is not, I don't think we've used this yet. This is what we call the UV editor. To get to the UV editor, you go to panels, panel, and then UV editor at the very bottom. And it's just a big grid. So because it's a grid, it's only 2 dimensions. So there's, and the dimension or the coordinates are U's and V's. So moving around here is similar to moving around in an orthographic view. If I hold down Alt and right mouse drag, it zooms in and out. If you hold down the middle mouse button and Alt, you can pan around. And you can see the left mouse doesn't do anything with Alt, but it's just another way to pan. So either middle mouse dragging or left mouse dragging with Alt pans. But the important thing is this this one quadrant that has the grayed area or the colored area is where all of your UVs need to be placed. There's a whole bunch of more space, and you can use the rest of the space to kind of organize stuff before you've assigned stuff. But everything in the end needs to be placed in this square for what we call a UV snapshot. So let's talk a little bit about UVs. So these look like these are faces. You can see that as I hover over the UV editor, you can follow its faces in the front view. And actually now I remember what I did. So these faces are actually upside down. So I'm going to correct this real fast, and then I'll get back to what I was talking about. So I'm just going to flip these upside down. And I'll get into the tools that we're going to use, but one of them is rotate. That's not the right one. There's a couple different rotation tools you can use. There you go. So yeah, I'm going to flip it 180, and you can see the fist is upside down here and it's right side up in the UV editor. So if I hit rotate UVs, now it's correct. So essentially that just rotated these faces 180 degrees. All right. So in the UV editor, you can select faces, you can select edges, and you can hover around and you'll find the edges that's on his face right there, right across his mouth. But the important one is UVs. You can even, those are my vertices like we've been doing, but the main thing that we want to use this for is UVs. So if you right click and hold and go to UVs, right click and hold and go to UVs in the viewer. I don't know if it's really obvious to you guys. Let me hit 4. These are in the exact same position as our vertices. I don't know if you notice the difference between vertex mode and UV mode. They're a little bit bigger so you can see them better. In the past, vertices were more of a magenta color and the UVs were brown. So anyway, so what's the main difference between UVs and vertices? So for vertices, they are essentially the points where edges or faces intersect. So for edges and faces to intersect, you need 3 coordinates, the X, Y, and Z. And even though a vertex has 3 coordinates, there are only U's and V's for texture mapping. And I have a little demonstration here that I like to use. So you guys can see my little tangerine. So I'm going to put a little spot on this tangerine. You guys can see that little hole that I made there? Where'd it go? Right there. Anyways, I made a little dot and I poked it all the way through because that's going to be my, on the outside, that's going to be my UV. On the inside, that's going to be my vertex point. So if I peel this orange or this clementine or whatever, this is very much, the same idea of globe. And I'm going to use a Sharpie so it's a little bit more obvious for me because I can't see it otherwise. My pen doesn't mark very well. Okay. So if you took the world, or like a world, like a globe, and you peeled off the decal that makes up the map of the world on the globe, you'll get something like this. So here's my globe or my 3D object, and you can see there, that point right there, that little black spot, that represents my vertex position in X, Y, and Z coordinates. This I can flatten this out. This represents my UVs, and you still have a single point there, but that only has a U and a V because it's going to be flattened in a 2D plane. So hopefully that helps you guys understand UVs a little bit better. But yeah, so every vertex has a UV coordinate point. So how do we unwrap these? So let me go back to the bottom and go to the front view and go back to face mode. So the way I originally unwrap these, or we call these projections. So I'm going to reproject these faces on the bottom in a way that is going to help me to create a nice edge there. So there's my projection. And the projection tool that I like to use almost not exclusively, but more often than not is the best camera. So I'm going to go to the bottom view, and you can see if I select the bottom view, it's going to show everything. It's not going to be at an angle. Like if I were to use the camera view, it would project it maybe more like an ellipse, and then I'd have to straighten it out in the UV editor. But if I use the bottom view, it gives me the perfect circle. So I'm going to go to UV camera based, and you can see it when you first project these, it's going to project in the entire space of that that square, and it's right. It projects it right to the tangent of the edge, the edge of the frame. And I've already organized this in Photoshop. But all of these projections that I'm going to make, they need to be organized in a way so they're not sitting on top of each other, because you can see with this, I'm going to go back to object mode for a second. With that bottom projection covering most of the that grid space, you can see that picks up his face, his fist, his clothes, the top of his head, the bottom of his head. So you want to minimize that. So I'm going to go back to the UV editor and UVs, and I'm going to double click on one of these UVs, and if I double click, it creates it doesn't create, it's already created a shell when I projected it. So then I can move that around. So each one of these are essentially shells. There's the head shell. This is the lower body shell. That's the upper body shell. That's the first neck shell. That's the second neck shell. And I may change this one, like I said, this very top shell that I made, I may recreate this to be part of the head shell. But so going back to this shell that I made for the bottom, yeah, so I don't want this whole thing showing. I want to minimize it so that it's just the size of this green patch that I made in Photoshop. That's my texture map that I've already created. And there's a tool that is commonly used in that texture artists use to before they actually create their texture map in Photoshop. They will use just a square grid, like a checkerboard grid, to help them make sure that their spaces are properly lining up and everything. But before I get into that, I just want to make a point that one of the most important things about this space in the UV snapshot, all these UVs, you want to take up as much space as possible. This is very valuable real estate. The smaller the images that you bring in here, the more pixelated it's going to be. So you want to be able to bring in larger images so they can, especially like in the face, if you have a human character, or in the hands where you want to get like the fingernail details and stuff like that. You want to make those projections, that space in the projection bigger than like a t-shirt. I don't know if you, unless you wanted to show all the texture on your t-shirt. And this is actually a pretty decent version of that. You can see the textures there. So for now, I'm gonna assign a different texture map for now, just to show you guys what the process normally looks like. So to do that, I would open up a session of Google Images, and I'm just going to type in checkerboard. Oops. Texture map. And these are some pretty typical ones. You can see they have different colors, and they go rainbow, just black and white. They have numbers, they have letters. This is really specific, I mean, really detailed. So the point in using something like this is to be able to follow how the mesh treats these numbers and the colors and the shapes, because you don't want it to stretch. So I'm just going to use this one as an example. I'll copy this one. I'll say save image as, and which folder does it need to go into for me to be able to, for Maya to be able to find it? You guys remember?
Source images.
Source images, very good. So I'm going to go to Maya, or documents, Maya, projects, primitive theater, source images. And you don't want this long, ugly name. So just call it something simple like checker underscore TXTR. I'm going to save that. So back to Maya. And you do want them to be square. And for the most part, they are, because I mean, they're pretty commonly used. So they're easy to find. So my attribute editor, instead of this, what I have here, I'm going to switch this. So you can see it's already in my source images folder. If I just type texture here, or I'm sorry, checker here, and say enter, now it just picks it up. And that just took me to my source images folder. Okay, so let's see what this looks like. If I go back to object mode, you can see that the bottom is, there's no stretching at all. It doesn't line up very well with the rest of the body, but that's okay, because most ponds, you know, most pond chess pieces, they're going to have a velvet, or not a velvet, a felt bottom, like a green felt bottom. That's going to be different from the ivory or the plastic or the wood of the rest of the piece. So I'm not worried that these don't line up. But what I do want to have line up is, let's see. In fact, this isn't the one I used to create this. I used just a black and white checkerboard, and it actually lined up better. But with this, you know, I could, let me just show you some of the things you can do in the UV map. So I'm going to move these out of the way for these two shells out of the way for a second. And let's say I wanted to line up, I don't know, let's say I wanted to line up the 8s, where this 8 is right underneath this 8. So I would double click on this shell and drag it to the left or the right until they line up. And you can see they're not quite going to line up. So maybe I grab these guys and go the other direction. Oops, I passed it already. So now those 8s are lined up. In fact, if I look closer, there's some space in between those. So I could probably move these down. I'm going to move this guy up a little bit more. And this is actually changing what I've already done for because I've already figured this out, but I'm just showing you guys how you can line things up. If I didn't want this purple and, you know, this extra segment in here, I would try to do a better job of lining up this shell. I'm going to drag it up so that it hits right on that black, it falls right on that black line right here. And then I'm going to do the same thing with the bottom one, drag that up until it lines up on that black line as well. So I should be able to get rid of, yeah, so you can see it got rid of those, that extra segment that I didn't want. So maybe you don't want them to line up like this. The other thing is a seam. You can see this strong white line here is a pretty obvious seam, and you want these for the most part to be seamless. So you would move these around. Sometimes you have to just decide which is more important, to line up the 8s or to get rid of the seam. And for my sweater texture, I don't need them to line up like that. So it's more important to maybe line up the seams. So I was gonna just undo these for a second. All right, so that's kind of moving things around. That's kind of how you're gonna work in the UV editor. But we still need to, the only one that we've actually projected is the bottom. So I need to project the other ones, the other segments. So I already have this one created. So I'm just going to go to the face mode. And in order to project, again, you want to select the faces. And I think I use sphere to get this shape. And then the very, very top, I used a camera based as well. But this time I'm going to try to select, I'm going to see what this looks like if I can combine. I'm going to try to combine this very top piece with the rest of the head. So I'm going to double click both the head projection and this extra little piece. So since you guys haven't done that yet on your pawn, you would probably just go to the front view and make a marquee window from face mode around the entire head, including what was on the top. And this time I'm going to go to the top view, and we'll see how all this works. And I'm going to say projection. I'm going to say UV camera based, and it's giving me a circle again, which could be nice. But what I want to be careful about is how much it's going to stretch, because oops, sorry, hitting the wrong button. Okay, so you can see that grabbed the entire head, but you can see there's a lot of stretching going on. And the reason that stretches is because the shape of the object. So camera-based projections are best when the object is flat. Like this is, I mean, this whole pawn was originally a sphere, but I flattened out the bottom. So that's the ideal place to use a camera-based projection. So I'm not going to rely on this. Well, I could, let me actually just play with this a little bit. So I'm going to select these. I'm going to double click on this edge loop here. Oops, sorry, not the edge. Yeah, the edge loop. And you can see that that is on the inside of this whole thing. So if I scale this, in fact, before I do this, I'm going to move it out further because I don't want it to interfere with what's going on over here. So I'm going to drag this over another quadrant and go back to UVs. I'm sorry, edge mode. And all right, so I can see that anything that I do to this edge is going to also affect these edges, which are part of the neck. They're connected. If I try to deselect these, the edges around the neck, I'm going to hold down Control and try to deselect them. And it deselected them, but it also deselected the edges around the neck for the top of for the bottom of the head. So they're linked, and that's a good thing. So I'm just going to leave that alone. In fact, so the way I ended up projecting this so it looks better, I'm going to reselect the faces, and I'm going to say sphere. I'm going to use a sphere projection instead. So I go to UVs and then spherical. And you can see that it breaks it into this nice big square, except for the very top, which is kind of messed up. So I would scale this down so it fits better into the grid. And it takes a little bit getting used to how much scaling you can do, and you can stretch these too. So another thing that's a little confusing about working with UVs is when you scale something smaller, and maybe this is super obvious to you guys, but if I say scale it smaller, make it smaller, the UVs, you can see what's happening in the actual projection of that on the texture map onto your object. As you're scaling the UVs down, the projection gets bigger. So if I get it really small here, you can see how big it is. So it's really pixelated and messy. So you just have to find a balance. You want to take up as much space as you can with your UV shells, but you also need to, if you make them too big, you may get pixelated if you don't have a very clean UV map. Or I'm sorry, a UV, what's called a texture map that you've created in Photoshop. And if it's too small, it might not pick up enough detail, or it might show pixelation. So there's a couple different ways you can work with these faces here that are all messed up. I could just decide that I'm going to put an afro on this guy, which is never going to be removed from his head. So I'll never show that to the audience. Where is it? Reference mesh, cons. I think it's in a cons. No, where did I put it? Headgear, yeah. Oh, and it's connected to the, yeah. So even though there's these messy things here, if it's hidden under hair, you may not even need to ever deal with it. But just to show you how I would deal with it if I needed to, I took these faces that are projected kind of ugly, and I went to the top of it. And just like I did with the bottom, I'm going to use, this is close enough to being flat that I'm going to go ahead and say UV camera based. And again, it gives me a nice circle, but you can see that detail is, we don't need nearly that much detail. We don't need to show the whole map on this little bitty circle. So I can scale that way down and just kind of put it off here to the side. So that's the top. Oh, well, I didn't do a very good job scaling this. So I can hit R and scale it out. And again, I want to take up as much space as possible. So maybe I'll just tap the space bar and move this more in the center. And scale it up. Oh, it's a little bit too big. I think I'll pull it up a little bit more. That's pretty close. Maybe scale it just a little bit more in the X. And I need to drop this down a little bit. I don't remember where the felt texture lands, but and then for the torso, the waist and the neck, you could try either spherical or cylindrical. In fact, we can try one for each one and see which one works better. So I'm gonna double click the waist. And for you guys, if you hadn't already created this shell like I have, you would, oops, I turned off my character. You would just make a UV, or I'm sorry, a face selection. And just make sure that your marquee selects, you don't miss anything. Because sometimes if you don't make your marquee big enough, you might miss a couple of UVs like right there. Let's see, and I can see that I picked up and accidentally picked up a couple on the top, so I'm going to deselect those. I want that to be part of the upper body, not the lower body. And then I just want to check to make sure I got everything. Yeah, you can see that I missed something on the bottom, it looks like. Yeah. Yep, you can see that I probably needed to make this just a little bit bigger. Or I'm sorry, drop it down a little bit more. So I'm going to remake the marquee to right there. And now I've selected everything. The other thing is, this doesn't really matter with my texture because it's just like a sweater material, but you can see that the numbers are upside down. So again, if you wanted to flip the UVs, you can go to modify, rotate, and then I'm going to use the options box because I want to put a specific number in there. You can be really specific. You can say 90 degrees. Uh-oh, that didn't work. Well, I would go ahead and just select it and say modify. So I just double clicked on it. I was missing a selection when I did that rotation. That's why it didn't work. So rotate 90 degrees. And then if I rotate it 90 degrees again, now my number should be in the correct position. So especially if you have some kind of, I don't know, someone wrote something on their pants or something, or have a decal or whatever, like I have with my Black Power fist, you want to flip that correctly. So that's the bottom, and then the top. Oh, I'm sorry, I was going to project that. So yeah, double click. And if I say cylindrical, so I can use these as well. So the first one is a planar map. The second one is a cylindrical one. The third one is a spherical. And then this one, I can't remember what it's called. It breaks up the entire thing into smaller segments. And sometimes that's useful, especially when you have hands that you need to sew the fingers, the top part of the hand separate from the bottom part so you can get a different texture. But for our purposes, I'm just going to use, well, I'm going to show you the difference between cylindrical and spherical. So this is my cylindrical projection. And you can see, of course, it gets big. So if I scale this down, and I already know this works because this is what I used last time. And I just, scaled it and moved it into place. So that's cylindrical. If I hit spherical, because I chopped off the top and the bottom, this also projects very similarly to a cylindrical projection. So either one should be able to work. It's just a matter of me lining things up so they're in the right position. And then I use the cylindrical for the upper body. You can see these are all very similar. And you can see the nice sharp edge that it creates for my projection, my shell. And then the neck, I separated these into two different segments, but I didn't really need to. I could just just select everything above this line and below the headline. So if I go to the front view and just make this marquee, oops, it's going to be too big or too high. Yeah. And then if I say cylindrical, you can see it still works. And I would just scale this down and put it in place and stretch it and whatever. Or the other thing you can do, and I only segmented these because I wanted to give you the example. If I needed to paint, like, I don't know, maybe this is actually like a scarf. So maybe I would make these two ruffles like a, I don't know, maroon colored scarf. And the rest of this, maybe his upper body is like a sweater, and then maybe the bottom is blue jeans. So that would be a good reason to segment these. But if you're using all the same material, from the bottom all the way to the neck, like I did, all you need to do is make one projection out of all three of these segments, or actually there's 4 segments. So I would just use a cylindrical and then just scale it down. and position it. Let's see. So it depends on how your character is, you know, what the materials you're using for your characters are. And then I'll scale it again, scale it up. Maybe drag it up a little bit more. And I probably want to use that black line right there as my boundary. So I'll scale it just a little bit. Or actually, maybe that's good. We actually see what this looks like. Yeah, so these vertices, these UVs, they get really tight in here, really close together, and you can see that continues through here. So there might be some stretching that goes on inside there. The rest of it looks pretty decent. Maybe I could do something a little bit better through here. But the main thing is you want to eliminate seams. So like you can see the seam is really obvious. I could probably do something much better, like line up that seam right on the edge. So I'm going to double click this shell and then maybe just drag it over to the left until it's right on that seam. And it should disappear pretty darn close. You can keep moving it around until you get it to disappear. That's pretty decent. All right, so I've UV unmapped this. Oh, so yeah. So what the next step is to make a what's called a snapshot. And I know these aren't in the exact position. And for the most part, I very often end up going between Photoshop and Maya through the UV editor, going back and forth. I have Maya open in one window and I have Photoshop open in another window. And I'll make changes to my Photoshop and then I'll bring it into Maya and see what it looks like. And I just kind of go back and forth, trial and error. And then Maya just updates it as I reload it. So yeah, that's pretty decent. Excuse me. All right, so with this created, these texture, I'm sorry, these UVs laid out in a way that I can now plan for what I'm going to do in Photoshop. I'm going to go to UVs and I select the UV so they're all green, all the little dots. And then I go to image and down at the bottom it says UV Snapshot. So I'm going to select UV Snapshot. And I don't actually have Photoshop installed on this computer, but like I said, I already created my Photoshop image. And the other software that I have doesn't open target files, but when I was at Ringling, they had us create target files for our UV. This is going to be called a UV unwrap. But you guys can also use JPEGs or PNGs, just depending on what you prefer. PNGs will give you transparency. And these aren't going to be super high resolution. I guess you could increase the resolution here, but the UV map isn't. You don't need the UV map to be super high resolution because it's just kind of a blueprint for where you want to lay stuff out. In Photoshop, you're actually going to put these on layers and turn your UVs off once you're done. And so all you'll be showing is just the texture map. So yeah, 1024 by 1024 is fine. And then I would just, I would give it a specific name, especially because you guys have a bunch of different pawns. So I call this one protester pawn. And I think I deleted the A also. Oops, that's not what I wanted. There we go. UVs, oh, and I don't need the target extension because it's gonna save it as a JPEG. So be sure that you know where it's pointing. Right now it's on my E drive, which is a flash drive. And that's not where I want it to go. Make sure you say browse. And you can see now it's pointing to documents, Maya projects, primitive theater, and it's going to put it in the images folder. This is more for Photoshop, so you can leave it in the images folder, or you can see I already created one in the sorry, let me see. This is in the images folder. I created another one in source images, and I think I already saved on top of it. So yeah, I'll just go back to images for now, and I'll go ahead and save this, and I'll say yes, I want to replace it, and say apply and close. Yeah, so I'm going to save that, overwrite. Oh, you know what? It went back to the name, the wrong. I was going to update my name. So pawn UVs, I was going to call it protester pawn UVs, and then save that. And it's in Maya projects primitive. Okay, so I save that. So in Photoshop, I would open up this documents, Maya projects, and it's under images for now. So this is the one I just created. And you can see it's just a grid. It's just the UVs. And if the important thing is that it's just lining up for you. It's giving you a floor plan so you can then in Photoshop put this on one layer, and then on a new layer you would make the head material, the head stuff, and on a second layer maybe the sweater stuff, and on a third layer you would make the felt, and on a fourth layer maybe this thing. Actually, I added a fifth layer because I added the fist to be in front of the sweater. So I had, I think, actually I had a layer for the originally I had a layer for the turtleneck kind of area, and then the upper body, and then the lower body. So I had more layers, but I realized now that all I needed was 1, 2, 3, 4 layers, or 5 layers with the decal. So do you guys feel comfortable enough in Photoshop? You guys are all used to using Photoshop. You know how to put things on layers and put things on transparency and stuff, or opacity. So generally what I do is I'll put this layer, this snapshot, UV snapshot, on the top. It'll be my top layer, and I'll set it to like 50%. And then everything else that's underneath it will show me that I'm lining stuff up inside this to make sure that I've put things in the right place. All right. So you could, this is an earlier version that I did, and I was just painting stuff in the if you want to, if it helps at all, you can label, in Photoshop or whatever your photo editing software is, you can label stuff head or, whatever. But if you just organize it, and it doesn't have to be top to bottom, whatever is easy for you to organize, it's up to you guys. Just make sure to take up as much space as you can. All right, so again, going back to my object, if I go to attribute editor, so once I'm done with this, I'm going to reassign the shader. So I'm going to go to source images, and this is the pawn texture that I've already created. I'm going to say open, and this is what, again, this I've already showed you, but this is what it looks like. And you can see I move stuff around a little bit. So, and this is going to be pretty typical as you move stuff around in Photoshop. Some things you can just fix it in the UV editor, and then some things you actually need to go to Photoshop to fix. So if I select my UVs, you can see that this shell got a little bit too big, so it's clipping into the felt area. And I'm going to make my screen as big as I can, and I'm just going to scale it down just a little bit and drag it up so it's out of that shell, or out of that that green area. Maybe a little bit more. Oh, I forgot. I did have more layers in Photoshop because I forgot that I created a face for this guy. So yeah, I gave him like a eyes layer and then a mouth layer and then a goatee layer. And I think I put his brows and his goatee on different layers. And you can do things like animate textures. So, you know, he's a three-dimensional object in Maya, but then if you wanted to animate the textures back and forth to give him like a frown or a happy face or something, you could do that. But I think for our purposes, we probably need to keep it more simple. And then the felt, of course, I need to move this back into place and scale it back down. And I want to be careful that I scale it enough so that I don't see the black inside the this shell. Here, scale it just a tad bit more. And if it's a little bit over, that's okay, because nothing else is interacting with that shell. And then move this guy up and scale him too. And you can snap to the grid here. If I had been more, organized this differently and maybe put this brown area for the top of his head right on the intersection of one of these, right in the middle of one of these intersections, I could just hold down X and snap it like we do in, like we're doing for modeling. But for now, I'm just going to eyeball these because it wasn't really necessary. Then I'll scale this down and move it up a little bit, or scale it a little bit more. So whether we're eventually going to get into Arnold, you still need to create a UV snapshot and organize your UVs in a way that's gonna look good for your textures. Let's see, so if I go back to object mode, yeah, his sweater's off a little bit too, because I moved these guys. So if I move this over a little bit, you can see that as I'm moving this, I'm centering that the fist again. And I'm gonna go back to object mode and check, and it's kind of dark, but you shouldn't really see a seam. I think I did a pretty good job of hiding the seam. It just looks like a texture, like a sweater he's wearing. And even with real sweaters, I mean, you actually do see a seam where it's sewn together or threaded together, whatever, knitted together. So that's pretty much UVs. I created a UV map. Oops. Right here. And there's a lot of tools you can use, but for the most part, you guys will be using, especially for the ponds. If you're going to UV map the pond, you're going to use best or camera based, which you'd set to the bottom view or the top view to get the flattest surface. For the head, I used cylinder, and no, I used a sphere. That's right, I used a sphere. But you could have also used a cylinder and just taken off the bottom, the very top of it, and use a camera-based projection for that. The body, depending on how much segments you need to make, you may create 1, 2, 3, 4 different segments to project. Or if it's just one big solid color, or like I have a great big sweater, you just need one cylindrical projection. And then once you have that all done, you select your UVs, you hit images, and then say UV snapshot, takes a picture of it. You bring that into Photoshop, put that on the top layer, and then do whatever paint job you want to do. And you save that. I forgot to mention, so I saved the Photoshop, out of Photoshop, I saved it as a JPEG. You may want to save it as a TIFF. TIFFs are supposed to be better about keeping data. But I've had JPEGs for years, and I don't see any deterioration in them. Yeah, so you assign it, and so assigning it is, again, just going to, so first you assign the new material, and then you pick either Lambert or Blinn or whatever, and you name it specifically, if this is pink or orange or pawn or whatever, _shader. And then you assign it, you go to the color box and you go to your folder. And again, Out of Photoshop, you save your image to the source images folder in Primitive Theater. And then you select your correct texture. You may have a couple different ones for different pawns, and you say open. And then that should assign it to you. So do you guys have any questions? You guys ready to give it a shot? So if you guys have swords or more boxy objects, you can also, you might be able to use cylindrical for that. But if it's a flat surface, you may want to use a planar projection or camera-based. Either one will work. And there's some other tools that eventually I can show you as you need them. There's a sewing tool, and there's also a cut tool. For example, if I decided, you know what, I really do want to have this neck area separated. So go back to the front view, and let's say I wanted to create a new that segment again along this edge. I can select that edge and then go to modify. Is it modify? Let's see. Oh, actually cut. So I could say cut, and you can see that line gets highlighted a different color. If I double click on that shell, you can see that it separates that shell from the bottom shell. Or if I wanted to sew them, I would just do the opposite. I would select these guys and say, actually, maybe I'll double click them and just deselect the rest of this stuff. And I missed a couple. And I would say, so, and it just merged them back together. So now they read as one shell again. So for the most part, those are the tools I use for unwrapping a texture. You can also individually select vertices and move them around. And especially with something organic like a human character, I find that I have to do a lot of this adjusting. I'll be, looking at what it's doing to make sure that it lines up properly. And I don't even know where these are right now. I should find them before I start moving stuff around. But, with this texture, this sweater texture, it's, it's already in a good shape. But you can see that I'm starting to mess it up. It was nice before. And as I move these around, you can see it starts to squash them or pinch them or whatever. So maybe actually while you guys are working, I'll bring up my my monster that he's one of my thesis characters, my Bigfoot, and I'll show you his UV texture map because that was a pain. And I still don't have it perfect the way I want it to be, but it's a lot better than it was. So alrighty, so I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing for now. Any last questions? Or any questions? All right, so I'm going to stop recording. Do you want me to go ahead and get out of the session of Zoom and then come back in so you guys can have the recording sooner? Would that be helpful?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to